Welcome to the Lexington Public Library's Tales from the Kentucky Room podcast, where we discuss everything Lexington and Fayette County history. I'm Mariam, and in each episode of this podcast, we will feature a guest that will share a piece of local history. So thank you for tuning in and enjoy. On this episode of the podcast, we have with us Stuart Sanders, the author of Anatomy of a Duel, Secession, Civil War, and the Evolution of Kentucky Violence. Stuart Sanders is the Director of Research and Publications for the Kentucky Historical Society. He was the former Executive Director of the Perryville Battlefield Preservation Association. He is also the author of 5 other books, including Perryville Under Fire, The Aftermath of Kentucky's Largest Civil War Battle, The Battle of Mill Springs, Kentucky, Manny's Confederate Brigade at the Battle of Perryville, and Murder on the Ohio Belle. His book is available for checkout at Lexington Public Library or for purchase at your local bookstore. Thank you so much for joining us, Stuart. So glad to have you on the podcast. Before we get started, can you just give us a little bit of an introduction to your background with the Kentucky Historical Society and other research projects that you've worked on?
Sure. I grew up in Lexington, Virginia, which is in the Shenandoah Valley, which is sort of full of Civil War history, as you can imagine. However, in 1996, started working for the Perryville Battlefield Preservation Association, which is a nonprofit organization that at the time was trying to preserve and interpret Kentucky's largest Civil War battleground at Perryville. And so I worked there for about 10 years. And then for the past 18, actually, I've been with the Kentucky Historical Society. During that time, worked in every corner of the building and now serve as Director of Research and Publications there.
Oh, wow. So you come across a lot of neat research then.
Oh, definitely. Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. That's what makes the job a lot of fun.
Yeah. So Anatomy of a Duel, how did you get started on this particular research? You know, most people that are familiar with Kentucky duels and Kentucky history know of Winston Coleman's book, famous Kentucky Duels. Your book kind of deals a little more of a societal impacts and historical in terms of the Civil War and secession, and et cetera.
Right.
Give us a little background about how you started this research and what compelled you to write a whole book about it.
Right. So I've been this is my 5th book, actually. I've been writing a lot of Civil War history over the years. And this particular duel, it sort of is the intersection of 2 just sort of research topics that I'm interested in, one being the Civil War, and then the second being kind of interpersonal violence and how did Kentuckians use violence as a means of conflict resolution during the 19th century. And so dueling became kind of a perfect topic. And, just sort of dovetailing those, the Civil War with dueling is how I sort of stumbled on this topic. And actually, using Coleman's book is how I first read about the duel between Leonidas Metcalf and William Casto. And the Civil War hook is that Leonidas Metcalf was a Union colonel, and then Casto was a pro-Confederate civilian. And they dueled in May of 1862 near Maysville using rifles at 60 yards. And the duel really had its roots in the Secession crisis because Metcalf had led a troop of men who had arrested Casto for being pro-Confederate. And that sort of spent Casto on a downward spiral of wanting to seek revenge. When he was eventually released from this Union prison, he quickly found Metcalf, who he blamed for sort of impugning his honor and shaming him and embarrassing him through this arrest, challenged him to a duel, and then they ended up, fighting just a few days later.
Yep. And that was the whole background of duels is honor and code. And, there's a whole code behind duels and such, if anyone knows anything about the Broadway hit Hamilton. Right. So give us a little bit more about the whole cultural background, especially in Kentucky. There was almost like a shift in that Civil War period on duels.
Right.
There's pre-Civil War duels and post. There's a little bit of a difference, I felt like, from reading your book and other research. Give us a little bit of background about what dueling meant and why it was so normalized and it's just became part of the culture.
Right. So dueling sort of came to Kentucky in probably the late 1700s, brought here by Virginians and North Carolinians, who'd sort of embraced this, what we call kind of the Southern honor culture. And what honor essentially is, it's what is your reputation and how does your community view you to be and how do you view yourself? And it's sort of, you're upheld as kind of a higher standard of, again, honor is how you wanted to mostly avoid sort of shame or public embarrassment. And so if you were insulted or if there was a failed business deal, or if, someone from your same social class stole from you, the way you'd kind of avenge that insult and keep your honor intact, if you were from the same social class, was to fight a formal, structured duel. And so you have a lot of upper-class Kentuckians dueling during this period, from Henry Clay to Cassius Marcellus Clay to John Rowan to, sort of most noted Kentuckians from that period. If they didn't duel, they sort of knew people who did or, played a role as being a second. But that kind of honor culture drove people to the dueling ground during that time. And, it seems completely insane today for two people to stand, 10 paces apart with pistols and exchange gunfire as a way to sort of save your reputation.
Takes those Twitter feuds all
right,
to, or
exactly.
X or whatever you call it now.
Sends it to a different level.
Yeah.
But, it did happen in Kentucky. It was sort of seen the mark of a gentleman to have a pair of, finely crafted English dueling pistols. So it became this sort of cultural norm. And, if someone from a different social class, however, insulted you, as a wealthy gentleman, it was up to you to sort of deal with that affront immediately instead. So, there are a lot of stories in Kentucky newspapers of upper-class Kentuckians, instead of challenging someone from a lower class to a duel, instead they would, horsewhip them or cane them on the street, things like that. So there, culture played into it, class played very heavily into it as well. And dueling started going out of fashion during the Civil War because, as soldiers were killing each other in droves on battlefields across the South, sort of the idea, I think people began to realize just sort of how ludicrous that was. However, that sort of honor culture stayed intact. So after the Civil War in Kentucky in particular, you still had upper-class Kentuckians having this sort of hair-triggered temper and a reaction to insult. So instead of if someone insulted you in the 1870s, 1880s, and even later, instead of issuing a formal challenge, you'd instead, pull your concealed weapon and immediately start shooting. And so there were a lot of episodes from our past, sadly, involving, murders on the street that were caused by insult and things like that.
And of course, those duels didn't always ended up in death or somebody injured or depending on what they decided to, where they decided to.
The point of dueling wasn't to necessarily kill your opponent. It was just to sort of show that you were honorable and keep your reputation intact.
Like save face.
Yeah. And so a lot of times if you agreed to duel with pistols at 10 paces, which is typically 30 feet, you exchanged the first round of fire. If no one got shot, the seconds, who were your assistants basically, or friends who were acting on your behalf, would kind of negotiate and say, look, has honor been satisfied? Do we need to continue? In a lot of instances, they would say, yep, honor's satisfied. My reputation's fine. We're not going to keep firing guns at each other. But in some instances where, the insult was determined to be pretty grave, some duelists would want to see blood drawn, and they would keep the fight going. That happened to Henry Clay a few times. The duels that he fought, the first shot they would always miss, and then the second shot, they would continue on. And in the first instance, Clay was actually injured in the leg in one duel in 1807.
So the illustrious Henry Clay was heavily involved in duels, as well as Cassius Clay, which we've covered in previous podcasts. And they're famous politicians, and they would have had to take the famous oath of not having fought a duel. How did they circumnavigate that issue, and how did they, escape prosecution?
It's probably the best. Dueling was illegal in Kentucky, starting in the 1850 Constitution, as you noted. People who wanted to be attorneys or politicians had to swear this oath that not only had they not dueled, but they had, not acted as a second or participated in any of the dueling. And, attorneys would lose their law licenses if they dueled. And that oath still exists today. So people, for example, who are a politically appointed library board member, they even have to swear that duel. If you're an attorney, you have to swear. From those positions up to the governor of Kentucky, they all have to, hold their right hand up and say they've never dueled or participated. However, during the 19th century, this sort of need to keep your reputation intact and your desire to keep your honor crystal clear.
There was no such thing as background checks.
Right,
So.
exactly.
There you go.
Exactly. They would still duel because that sense of personal honor outweighed the risk of being prosecuted. And sadly, most prosecutors supported dueling, so they rarely prosecuted people for doing the practice. But again, there were lawyers who lost their law licenses, and there were some consequences for people. But, the worst consequence was a lot of people weren't ever charged for murder, even if they killed someone in a duel, because it was just seen as being something that went on. And,
it was turned a blind eye to it just because it was so ingrained in the culture.
Right.
And like I mentioned, we've covered in the podcast the famous duels of Cassius Clay and the knife fight in the post office between Swope and Goodloe.
Right.
Give us a little bit of what your favorite, or not favorite, but like the most fascinating duel fight that you found interesting.
There are a lot. Let me mention a couple.
There's a lot to choose from, unfortunately, in Kentucky.
One that I really there's one I like because of a macabre artifact that's tied to it. And Gosh, prior to 1850, in Bardstown, there was a man named John Rowan who ended up owning the house that's now my old Kentucky home. And he was at a tavern sort of enjoying a few drinks with some friends, and he and a man named Chambers began arguing over who had a better mastery over ancient languages. And believe it or not, that led to a fight, and then they ended up finding each other on the dueling ground, which is, so for me, is being a more absurd reason to shoot at someone, whether or not you could speak Latin or Greek better. It's not a good reason. But Rowan ended up killing Chambers in that duel, and then he fashioned a ring that contained a locket of Chambers' hair. And the Kentucky Historical Society still has that ring. So if you get on our website and look at our objects catalog, you can actually find that ring. Just look up duel ring, and it should pop up. But it's pretty creepy. But it's the fact he kept it as a memento also sort of points to it was sort of showing that he had kind of survived and had upheld his honor. For me, another interesting duel is related to a place, and that's the Kentucky Horse Park in that area, because during the 19th century, that was the farm of James K. Duke, who was a noted farmer in the area. And you can still see the Duke house if you're driving towards Cincinnati on the interstate. It's sort of unfortunately, I think a crumbling white frame house now. I think it's in pretty bad shape. But in the 19th century, it was the Fayette County-Scott County line, and a lot of duels were fought on county lines, so no one could determine prosecutorial jurisdiction. So it would sort of lessen your chance of being prosecuted if they couldn't figure out what county you're actually fighting in. And on that farm, again, now part of the Kentucky Horse Park, there were, I think, at least 5 duels fought there. And one included 2 doctors who fought a duel. They'd had an argument over a post-mortem examination, and one actually shot the artery of another and then ended up stepping in and saving the man's life. So that's an interesting one. And then 2 Transylvania University students actually fought there in the 1850s using shotguns at 40 yards, and one killed the other, essentially blew his head off. And so that dueling ground, however, saw the Deshay-Kimbrough duel, which to me is really interesting. It happened in 1866. Right after the Civil War, and Deshay and Kimbrough had been sort of enemies when they were schoolboys, and them fighting on different sides during the Civil War didn't help. Deshay had been a Confederate officer, was wounded a number of times, had a shattered left arm. Alexander Kimbrough was a Union sergeant and had a shattered leg. Both had been gravely injured in different battles, but they'd encountered each other in a tavern, I think in Paris, got in a fist fight that led to a challenge to duel, and at what is now the Kentucky Horse Park, one early morning, they fought a duel using Henry Clay's pistols. And Deshay actually shot Kimbrough through the hip and ended up sort of, this poor Union veteran who already had bad legs was again wounded and in this duel. And Deshay ended up fleeing to Canada with his second. They spent 10 years there in exile, fearing prosecution. And finally, Governor James B. McCreary, who was also a Confederate veteran, who probably knew both men, ended up pardoning them. And then he returned to become a noted horse breeder. And so, to me, the idea that one place would sort of have so much related to an affair of honor is also pretty interesting. The fact that all these duels were fought there.
Around the Kentucky Horse Park and that land over there. It's interesting that land is actually used as soccer fields now. Some of the
different type of duel.
My son was playing a game there, and I thought, wow. And I just kept thinking about the history.
It's crazy.
And it's very interesting to me. Yeah.
The Deshay-Kimbrough duel, the fact that one was a Union veteran, one a Confederate veteran, at a time when other Kentuckians were sort of seeking reconciliation. They're out there exchanging pot shots with Henry Clay's pistols. Just makes it pretty interesting to me.
It does. So you talked about the artifacts at the Kentucky Historical Society. What other artifacts can people go to view there? Give us a little bit of information about for our listeners who are interested to come visit.
The Kentucky Historical Society is actually, we view it as a campus. And so we've got the Thomas D. Clark Center for Kentucky History that has both temporary exhibit space and a permanent exhibit gallery covering thousands of years of Kentucky history, from prehistory on. We also manage Kentucky's Old State Capitol building and the Kentucky Military History Museum at the Old State Arsenal. And so we've got 3 different museum sites you can visit. So we have everything from, on display, we have a plaster cast of Daniel Boone's skull, for example, to Abraham Lincoln's pocket watch, to a Corvette. I mean, it really runs the gamut of different items that are associated with Kentucky history throughout that, well over 250 years of history.
What other books have you released? You mentioned that you have released other books.
Yeah, my first was called Perryville Under Fire, The Aftermath of Kentucky's Largest Civil War Battleground. And so when I worked at Perryville, the story I always heard was that every house, every church, every home became a field hospital to contend with all the wounded troops. And so I decided to start researching that. And it's true. Every building, anything with a roof, from churches to businesses to homes, became hospitals because there were more than 7,500 men killed and wounded at Perryville, plus thousands of sick soldiers. And so most of the town's 300 inhabitants had to deal with not only caring for the wounded and sick, but also burying the dead. And so it sort of looks at what happened when the firing stopped. And, Danville, Bardstown, Lebanon, Springfield, surrounding communities all became vast field hospitals after the battle. And so that book kind of examines that and what were the consequences to local civilians, too, who lost, cattle and horses and had their lives completely overturned. And so that was that first book. My second book was on the Battle of Mill Springs, Kentucky, which was fought in January of 1862. It was a major turning point in the war. It was fought down near Somerset, Kentucky, and it was the first Union victory in Kentucky, a major Union victory that sort of drove the Confederates out of the state at a critical time. And so it looks at that early Union victory and how that impacted the rest of the war in the state as part of that. My third book is called Manny's Confederate Brigade of the Battle of Perryville. It's sort of a command study that examines one brigade that endured some of the heaviest fighting. As these troops fought on the Union left flank, a lot of the regiments suffered well over 50% casualties, which is sort of unheard of in a Civil War battle. So they were fighting from one hilltop to the other, and there was a staunch Union defense. So it looks at the soldiers who participated in that battle and talks about why it's one of the most important parts of the Battle of Perryville. My fourth book is called Murder on the Ohio Belle, which looks at a murder and vigilante justice that took place on a steamboat that went from Cincinnati to New Orleans and back, and the murders took place in 1856. And that's also sort of a Southern honor story, too, because there was a wealthy planter on board who was manhandled out of the cabin by what he perceived as being a lowly steamboat clerk. He then killed the man. The crew took justice in their own hands. And the twist in the story is that the Mississippian who committed this murder really wasn't who he said he was. And even though he was a planter's son from Holly Spring, Mississippi, he was on the run for committing an earlier heinous crime. And so it's that book also delves into kind of Southern honor culture and interpersonal violence on steamboats, and kind of steamboat life in general. So I've got, I've become an official steamboat nerd, I think, after writing that book too. But
yeah. Well, when I was doing research for this podcast, I had read about the book. And I was like, okay, this is a podcast episode all in its own. We'll have to have you back sometime. Thanks. So
yeah, and that story, I found actually while researching Anatomy of a Duel. I sort of wrote that book as a break, as I needed a break from kind of doing the research, and I was just sort of researching interpersonal violence and stumbled across a story about a drowned man who was found bobbing the Mississippi River tied to a chair. And so I thought, well, this is horrible. How did he end up like this? And, started pulling the thread, and, that became this book, Murder on the Ohio Belle. And so he was the victim he was the Mississippian who'd committed this murder and had been thrown in the river by, an angry crew. But again, the twist is, why was he on the boat in the first place? And, why did he commit the murder? And then also, what had he done in his past? So
does that happen to you a lot when you're doing your research?
Yes,
like you kind of pull a thread and you go down a rabbit hole.
Yeah, because I've got, about, not kidding, like 10 different books in various stages of completion, because I keep finding something else that I get really excited about. And then, it's a little bit of a curse. But I have piles and piles of note cards of different topics that I want to do something on, whether it's an article or...
Well, that takes me to my last question is what future projects do you have of those 10 different...
Yeah, there are a lot. To be honest, a lot of them deal with interpersonal violence at various stages of Kentucky history. And so what I'm working on now is a murder case that took place here in Lexington in 1923. And so it's sort of an intersection. It was a time when... unfortunately, a lot of Kentuckians carried concealed weapons, and it's the result of that mixed with sort of alcohol and prohibition. And so sort of the first part of the book looks at this murder, and the second part examines the family of the man who committed this murder, which then leads to stories about local political corruption and other things like that. So it's kind of a sins of the son, sins of the father story that kind of through the lens of this one murder that took place downtown in 1923.
Interesting. Yeah. Well, we'll be looking forward to that. That is a very interesting period in U.S. history, but also, of course, local history, because it was very rife with changing times, and the civil rights movement was starting to bubble up. And
that's when King Tut's tomb had been quote unquote discovered at that time, and so that sort of looms over like, when I'm doing newspaper research, I keep finding these articles on King Tut, which has been pretty fun. So it's a nice little distraction from, but it was also a time too when, and I talk about this in the book Anatomy of a Duel, but when, what was affecting Kentucky's national reputation, because we went from, the 1850s being the home of, Henry Clay and erudite Kentuckians who were horse breeders to a much, seen nationally as being a very violent place. And so that reputation, started declining because all these upper-class Kentuckians were killing one another on the street in the 1870s and 1880s, on to the 1920s when concealed weapons was a major problem. They were constantly shootouts tied to prohibition, a lot of crime in the state. And including in the middle of those two periods, you have Governor William Goebel getting assassinated in front of what is now the old state capitol in 1900. And so, newspaper headlines constantly screamed about violence in Kentucky and, what a terrible place it was related to shootings and other killings. And so, it's a sad thread that you can find from the end of the Civil War on till almost World War II. It's taken a while to sort of lose that reputation of being, seen as a violent place, unfortunately.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for joining us on the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
It's been
fun.
Fascinating. I can't wait to see what you come up with.
Well, thanks.
Next. So we'll definitely have you again.
Sounds wonderful. Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much, Stuart. Thanks for listening to Tales from the Kentucky Room, a podcast brought to you by the Central Library's Kentucky Room staff at the Lexington Public Library. If you enjoyed listening, please take a minute to subscribe, rate, and review the podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever else you get your podcasts. If you have any questions about local history or genealogy research, you can visit us in the Kentucky Room to use our collection and newspaper microfilm, or you can email us at elibrarian@lexpublib.org. That's elibrarian@lexpublib.org. I'm Mariam, and we'll be back with another trip down Lexington's memory lane.